Hi, my name is Leah Parrino, and this week's learning module is about internal and external communications. There are 3 learning outcomes for this week's module. The first is to identify major components of successful strategic communication. The second is to understand the differences between active and passive listening. And the third is to explain what nonverbal communication is and provide examples. Successful communication is much more complicated than simply telling someone what you want to say to them. To communicate successfully, there are a number of steps to take to make your message as effective as possible. Step 1 is to identify your audience, so this would be who are you communicating to. People respond to messages differently, and it's important to tailor your message to the person or group that you're addressing to make sure that they perceive and understand what you're trying to say. If you're dealing with multiple audience, you'll need to find a way to clearly convey that message to everyone. Step 2 is to determine goals and objectives. So this would be why are you communicating the message and what do you need to achieve by communicating it. So everything you communicate with someone should have a purpose and be part of a larger goal. For example, if your company's goal is to increase sales, you would want to make sure that your messages work toward achieving that and trying to generate sales with consumers. Step 3 is to develop key messages. So what do you need to communicate? If you develop clear and concise messages with the most important information, so key information, this will help to create easy to understand content, and it will also be sure to get across the most important parts of your message. Step 4 is to develop a tactical plan. So this includes how and when will you communicate with a person or a group. A tactical plan is essentially a blueprint for communicating your strategy, for your communication strategy rather, and this includes your goals and how to support them. And lastly, step 5 is to identify measures of evaluation. So this would be how you know if your communication method was successful. You should always create and track metrics to know if you're getting closer to your goal, and having a set goal and being able to see where you are working toward that will help you see if you need to make any changes or what's going well so far. Next is active versus passive listening. There is a big difference between active and passive listening. Passive listening is what you want to try to avoid. This means you're just hearing what someone's saying, and you're not really trying to understand their message. You might just be listening for the sake of trying to formulate a response, or you're just trying to get through the conversation. You're not really there trying to absorb what the meaning of what they're saying is. Active listening, on the other hand, is when you try to understand the speaker, you show acceptance of their message and avoid judgment while they're speaking. So there are some ways to improve active listening. Active listening is very important, so it's good to try to work toward improving this skill. So making eye contact, avoiding distractions and interruptions, asking questions for clarity, and not talking over the speaker are all some ways to improve. These actions are all important because they show the speaker that you care about their message and that you care about trying to understand them and really know what they're trying to say. Next is nonverbal communication, which is just important as the actual words that you're saying out loud. This includes a variety of different actions, including facial expressions, body movements, your posture, gestures, eye contact, touch, which would be like a handshake or a pat on the back, your tone of voice, and space. So that would be how close you are to the person you're speaking with. These nonverbal messages can send a different message to the listener than what you're actually trying to say. So it's important to try to be aware of what you're doing as you're speaking. So nonverbal communication can either contradict, substitute, complement, or accept, or accent, part of your message. Contradicting would be, for example, if you said you're glad to see someone, but you're frowning and just look unhappy. Substituting could be using a head nod instead of actually saying yes or no when someone asks you something. Complimenting is when your actions and your words are sending the same message to the person. And accenting just means that your nonverbal actions are emphasizing a particular part of your verbal message. Now, these are some supplemental materials to help better understand some information from this week. First source is an article that better describes the difference between regular communication and strategic communication, and what you can do to try to make all of your communication more strategic. The second article explains the differences between passive and active listening, how this relates to different types of relationships, and how to improve listening skills. And the last article discusses how nonverbal communication plays a role in the workplace, and how what you're doing might be sending a negative or positive message to your coworkers. With that being said, this week's discussion questions are: what are some major components of successful strategic communication? What are some ways to improve active listening, and why is this important? And lastly, what are some types of nonverbal communication, and what role can they play while communicating? And these are the sources that were used to create this week's presentation.